Studio.
Tonight at 10, we're on the election trail in Carmarthen in South Wales. We'll bring together our experts to assess the political landscape here and all the issues that matter to you. Earlier, Reform UK launched its election pledges, including proposals on immigration, tax and the NHS.
Isn't this really a list of unrealistic promises?
It's a promise. This is what we're going to campaign for over the course of the next 5 years.
So those are Nigel Farage's long-term ambitions, but over the next 2.5 weeks, he could have a big impact on the result of this general election.
And the other main stories on tonight's programme. Witnesses tell the BBC of the Coast Guard in Greece forcing migrants back to sea and deliberately throwing some people overboard to their deaths. In Germany, England fans speak of overcrowding and being left stranded after they tried to get home from the team's match against Serbia.
Trying to tease his way.
On BBC London, a firearm is seized every single day by the Met Police. The force says more than half of shootings involve gangs or organised crime.
Hello and good evening from Carmarthen. More than halfway through this general election campaign, we are in Wales tonight looking at the political landscape of the nation and how it may change after polling day. We've also been asking you to get in touch and tell us about the issues you want the BBC to cover through Your Voice, Your Vote. We'll be hearing about green energy and the possible impact of its infrastructure on this beautiful landscape here. We'll have more on that in a few minutes. But first, Reform UK launched its manifesto today, or contract as the party calls it. The launch took place by chance in South Wales. As well as policies on immigration, Nigel Farage outlined pledges on tax and the NHS. With more details, here's our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth.
There was something of a stir outside this community club in Merthyr Tydfil. All eyes on a party that's certainly been attracting attention.
Will this be your big breakthrough?
Well, we're trying.
Nigel Farage was here to set out Reform UK's policy platform. And Wales, where Labour's in charge, was a deliberate choice for a party trying to pitch itself as the opposition.
People actually need some sense of being inspired, some sense of believing there's somebody up at the front that believes in what they say, says what they believe, and is going to show a way forward for the country.
What they call a contract with the voters features plans to cut immigration on page 1, proposing limits on who can come to the UK to work or live, and a pledge to stop the small boats.
I've said from the start, this should be the immigration election.
And there was more. Plans to cut taxes, abolish NHS waiting lists, ditch net zero policies and reform benefits to get people into work. You accuse other parties of broken promises, but isn't this really a list of unrealistic promises, a wish list rather than a serious plan?
It is a promise. This is what we're going to campaign for over the course of the next 5 years. I said at the very start, we are not going to be in government this time, but we are going to provide a voice of opposition.
He says he makes no apology for a radical platform, but do the sums add up? You are proposing some really significant tax cuts in this contract, billions of pounds worth, in part paid for by a £50 billion squeeze on wasteful government spending. What's going to go?
The size of departments. What we're arguing for here is a very modest cut. A very modest cut.
£50 billion a year?
£5 in 100, and that's the job of the Whitehall bosses, is to save £5 in 100. And anyone who's ever worked in the private sector will tell you, when times are tough, you have to cut things. And times are tough. You know, we are massively in debt. We have to become more efficient.
So there would be cuts to public services, to be clear. Times are tough, got to cut things, there'll be cuts to public services.
We've no desire for any cuts at all to the concept of things being free at the point of delivery.
So you can take £50 billion out of government spending with no cuts to public services?
You know what? The French have exactly the same amount of money being put in and get better returns on all health indices. We can do better.
He'll hope his pitch has popular appeal. The question is how far it might take his party. Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
Well, Ben Chu from BBC's Verify has been looking at all of this and can tell us more.
Yes, Jane, let's break down the economic pledges of Reform's contract, which is what they're calling their manifesto. There will be large personal tax cuts, including lifting the threshold for paying income tax to £20,000 per year, lowering fuel duty by 20p per litre and scrapping VAT on energy bills. Then there are some large spending pledges, including increasing defence spending to 3% of GDP within 6 years, increasing NHS spending by £17 billion a year. So how is all this to be paid for? Well, Reform says it would slash government waste, including by stopping the Bank of England paying commercial banks interest, saving £35 billion per year, and scrapping net zero environmental targets, saving £30 billion a year, and halving the foreign aid budgets, saving £6 billion a year. Now, economists, including those at the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, are doubtful about many of these claims. For instance, on banking, this is complex, but what you need to know is that this would effectively be a tax on the commercial banks, and experts estimate it will be likely to raise less than £10 billion a year, not £35 billion. And most economists judge that the costs of the UK failing to pursue net zero will ultimately be greater than the costs of achieving it. And what about immigration? Well, Reform says that they would freeze non-essential migration within the first 100 days. Economists say this could take some pressure off housing, but that it also raises the question of precisely how non-essential would be defined for immigration. And they caution that, interpreted strictly, this could have a negative economic impact, including on staffing public services. Finally, let's put the Reform manifesto in context. Here's the rough size of the Tory, Lib Dem and Labour manifestos in tax and spending terms, between £7 and £27 billion per year. And here is the Green Party's £172 billion. And here's Reform, £141 billion. As you can see, Reform and the Greens really tower over the other parties, and public finance experts feel that while individual elements of the latter two parties' programmes might be coherent, they feel that overall there is a lack of credibility. Jane.
Ben Chew there. Well, let's talk to our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young at Westminster, because, Vicky, we've heard Nigel Farage's long-term plans. How do you assess what his impact could be on this campaign?
Well, it was an unusual launch today because Nigel Farage laid out all these policies and then said, but actually I'm not going to be able to implement any of them because I'm not going to win the election. So he would say he was being very honest about that. Now, partly it's because of the electoral system. It's very hard for very small parties to win seats. He might, even on a good day, only end up with a few. But that doesn't mean that Reform will have no impact. If they're siphoning off potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of votes from the Tories, it makes it much harder for the Conservatives to fight off Labour. So how are the Tories dealing with this threat? Well, interestingly, at the beginning of the campaign, they laid out policies that you think might really attract those who are thinking of voting Reform, things like national service and lower taxes. It doesn't seem to be working, though, and the Tories are left now simply warning people thinking of voting Reform, you're just going to end up with a very large Labour majority. Now, Nigel Farage believes that people are frustrated with the political system, and he thinks people are turning to him because they don't trust either Labour or the Conservatives, and he hopes that his party will be the beneficiary of that.
All right. Vicky, thank you, Vicky Young. And there will be more analysis of the Reform pledges on Newsnight with Victoria Derbyshire.
Tonight we are going to examine Reform's promise to wipe out NHS waiting lists of 7.5 million in England within 2 years, and their patriotic curriculum for schools. What does that mean? Join us live. Newsnight, BBC Two and iPlayer at 10:30. See you then.
Well, on July the 4th, Labour here will be hoping to expand their dominance in Wales, while the Conservatives are defending the ground they won last time. In 2019, Welsh Labour won 22 seats, making them the largest party, despite the performance of the Conservatives, who won their greatest number of seats since the Thatcher years with 14. Plaid Cymru won 4 seats. But this election will be the first since a major boundary review, and that has cut the number of MPs in Wales from 40 to 32. Our Wales correspondent, Hal Griffith, has been looking at the political landscape in the run-up to voting day.
At the Whitland livestock market, they know all about making decisions under pressure. But when it comes to choosing who to vote for, there seems to be reticence, resentment even.
You know, what government is going to help the farmers at the minute, because we feel unsupported a bit.
None of them are for farming, are they? Really? So
do you feel forgotten or marginalised? Or...
Well, yeah, that's why we don't vote.
Brexit has changed the landscape for Welsh farmers and the subsidies they receive, leaving some here angry with both the UK Conservative government and the Labour administration in Wales.
Labour has been the dominant force in Welsh politics for over a century. For the last 25 years, it's been the party of government in Wales, responsible for health, education and agriculture. In this election, its record in power has come under real scrutiny.
So has its new leader in Wales, Vaughan Gething, who lost a vote of no confidence in the Senedd, but insists he can lead Labour to success.
I'm confident that I can regain the trust of the Senedd. I'm confident that I can do the job I've been elected to do just a few short weeks ago. And people will see the difference that we can make with two Labour governments working together.
Yes, we're here and we're ready to start.
If change is coming, the parents here in Ammanford want to feel it in their pockets. The cost of living, and childcare in particular, can feel punishing.
People are skint, and you know, my classes certainly, I got parents on maternity leave, so they are looking for ways to cut corners.
What's important to me is that we can provide for the family, and at the minute, by the time I go back to work, it's all going on childcare.
The offer for families in Wales is different to England, less generous, say the Conservatives.
We've had a Welsh Labour government in Wales for 25 years. They haven't done much about the cost of living standards. We've handed money over to the Welsh Labour government for things like childcare, the 30 hours of free childcare every week. That hasn't been passed on. What we have seen is millions of pounds being spent on things like the extra Senedd members.
For Plaid Cymru, this election is all about being seen and cutting through, trying to convince voters they can be a force in Westminster.
To me, it's about maximising Wales's voice, always. You know, we're in politics because we don't think this is as good as it gets for Wales, and we're in politics fighting for Westminster because we need somebody to be speaking up for Wales. Plaid Cymru will always do that.
For voters here in Carmarthenshire, it's almost time to pick a winner and decide who they want their voice to be. Hywel Griffith, BBC News, Carmarthen.
And just to tell you, there's a full list of all candidates standing in the general election on the BBC News website, of course. Now, throughout this campaign, we've been asking you to contact us through Your Voice, Your Vote. One of you got in touch about a plan to build a huge wind farm in Radnor Forest, 60 miles northeast of here, and then a corridor of pylons down the Towie Valley to connect into the national grid near here in Carmarthen. Our correspondent Coletta Smith has been to speak to some of the people affected.
If you come up here and look over this gate, where the fir trees are, it'll run all the way from Bilth through this valley.
Dina's been so shocked by big plans for turbines and pylons here that she got in touch with us at the BBC.
My father was brought up just over the hill, so it means a lot to us all. But I don't want my grandchildren turning round to my daughter and saying, "What did you and Nana do about it?" At least I've said something.
This project would take energy produced in giant turbines on a 60-mile pylon pathway spanning almost the width of Wales, cutting across this landscape.
People come here to the Upper Tower Valley in Dollarcothi for the rural delights, the peace and quiet, the dark skies.
You use electricity, we all do, we're using more of it, we're needing more of it. It needs to come from somewhere, doesn't it?
It does. Carpeting the Cambrians and rural Wales with turbines is effectively curing the disease but killing the patient.
Wherever energy is produced, whether it's on a hill here in Powys or up in Perthshire, it's connecting in to the same national energy grid in Britain. And that means that whoever's in charge in Westminster is responsible for working out the decisions about that mix of energy supply and how many points there are to connect it into the grid.
Industry groups say offshore energy won't be enough for Wales or the UK to meet net zero targets.
Onshore wind is the cheapest,
It's the quickest to build and it's the most readily deployable technology we have for renewable energy, and we desperately need to upscale the amount of renewable energy we're producing if we are going to be anywhere near meeting our targets in the next decade.
But many of those impacted don't agree. Diffin and Carris are fighting plans for 2 pylons in their fields. They want the wires to go underground instead.
We've stood under these oak trees that have been here hundreds of years, and these plans could just destroy that.
So you would be happy to have cables running under your land, right through the farm?
Sure.
They're taking a short-sighted view and not bearing in mind that the rest of us would be living with these pylons, for generations to come.
This part of the world now feels suspended between Britain's green energy priorities and its untouched natural beauty.
And Coletta is here with me, along with BBC Wales's political editor, Gareth Lewis. Good to have you. And Coletta, in terms of the story you brought us there, all the parties have something to say about onshore wind.
Yeah, we know that energy prices are a really crucial issue in this election. We know that there are millions of households right the way across the UK still struggling to afford just to pay those energy bills. So it's a really prickly issue for whoever eventually gets those keys for number 10 Downing Street. Labour have said in terms of onshore wind, they want to work with private companies to double the amount by 2030. The Conservatives say they're considering reducing energy bills for people who live close to wind farm developments. The Liberal Democrats say that we need to remove the current restrictions, as they call it, on onshore wind. Plaid Cymru and the SNP both say that there needs to be a careful balance between onshore wind developments and the natural environment. Reform have said that net zero is pushing up people's bills, and the Green Party say that onshore needs to be a significant part of that wind renewable mix. There are no simple answers, Jane. That's the difficulty with this issue. But whatever decisions are made will impact all of our bills, and it's also important to remember that they'll have a physical impact too in places like this.
Coletta, thank you. And Gareth, in terms of the broader political picture here, I mean, it is fascinating to watch. There is an awful lot going on here, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And you've chosen a great location. I mean, it's synonymous with Welsh political history and drama. It's here in Carmarthen that Gwynfor Evans became Plaid Cymru's first MP back in 1966. Carmarthenshire was the final and decisive count in the 1997 devolution referendum. As for the election itself, I think the big question is, will there be this red wave that sweeps pretty much everything before its path? Will Plaid Cymru manage to woo enough Labour voters that they're trying to do to win some of their target seats? Will the Conservatives' attacks on the Welsh Labour government's record on things like 20 miles per hour law, NHS waiting times, see them hang on where they're trying to hang on? And if Labour does win, there's a different dynamic then, a UK Labour government and a Welsh Labour government. They'd have you believe it'll be harmonious, and they say better for Wales. You can, though, start to see some tensions already emerging over things like future devolutions of power or not, future money coming this way or not. So plenty of drama, plenty of intrigue, plenty of subplots still to come, Jane.
Gareth, Coletta, thanks so much. Thank you. And that is it from the team here in Carmarthen tonight. Rita, back to you.
Thank you, Jane. Well, staying with the election, as you know, we've been testing claim and counterclaim with particularly close scrutiny of the two main Westminster parties. Senior Labour figures have been claiming that homeowners will pay £4,800 more on their mortgage if the Conservatives win the election. It's an assertion that Nick Eardley from BBC Verify is going to put to the test. Nick.
Thanks a lot, Rita. You might remember that earlier in the campaign, we looked at Rishi Sunak's dubious claim that Labour would put tax up £2,000. Now there's a claim from Labour that risks misleading voters too. And this is it, coming up on the screen here, that mortgages would go up £4,800 under the Conservatives. You can see it's been mentioned by Rachel Reeves on Instagram. Down here, Keir Starmer tweeted it this morning as well. To understand why this is potentially misleading, let's look at how Labour reached the figure. They've gone through the Conservative manifesto and done their own sums. The Conservatives say that they will raise £12 billion from a welfare crackdown. There are big questions about that sum, but Labour reckon they'll raise nothing. Labour also think that plans for national service will cost a lot more than the Conservatives have figured out. not 2.5 billion, 5.2 billion pounds. And putting those and other assumptions together, Labour have calculated there will be this, a 71 billion pounds spending gap. Labour have then assumed that the Conservatives would borrow all the money and then assumed that extra debt would push interest rates up as a result. So, a number of questionable assumptions so far. Bear with me though, because there are more. Labour have then taken the average house price, assumed an 85% loan to value, even though that's more than most mortgages, and then come up with this figure over 5 years, £4,800. It's not an annual figure, it's over a whole parliament, but it involves a lot of assumptions, some of them dubious, and for that reason, it risks misleading people. Rita.
Thank you very much, Nick. A BBC documentary has uncovered shocking claims that the Greek Coast Guard has caused the deaths of dozens of migrants in the Mediterranean over a 3-year period, including 9 people who were deliberately thrown into the water. More than 40 people are alleged to have died as a result of being forced out of Greek territorial waters or taken back out to sea after reaching Greek islands. With more, here's Paul Adams.
For more than 10 years, migrants looking for a better life have used a number of routes to reach Europe. Some travel from North Africa to Italy. Others cross from Turkey to the nearby Greek islands. For many, Greece is seen as the best way into Europe. Last year, just over 41,000 people arrived using that route. Human rights groups say thousands of people seeking asylum have been forced back illegally from Greece to Turkey, denied the right to seek asylum, something enshrined in international and EU law. The documentary looks into the role of the Greek Coast Guard in trying to stem the flow, and it raises some serious questions. For years, the Greek authorities have been accused of taking a sometimes uncompromising attitude towards asylum seekers attempting to reach the islands. The BBC has documented some of these episodes and heard stories of other practices which appear to breach international law. Video recorded last year showed one such episode. On the island of Lesbos, a group of migrants, including women and children, are taken back to the shore and escorted by masked men to a waiting Coast Guard ship. The boat heads out to sea, out of Greek waters. The migrants are put into a tiny life raft and set adrift, found later by the Turkish authorities. Greece says it's investigating.
It doesn't seem like it's forceful.
The footage is shown to the former head of the Coast Guard Special Operations. He says he sees nothing wrong with the video. But during a break, he takes a different line.
Δεν ξέρω γιατί το κάνανε για μέρα μεσημέρι όλος. Δεν ξέρω τι... Είναι κάθαρα παράνομο, προφανώς. Προφανώς παράνομο. Διεθνές έγκλημα, διεθνές αδίκημα.
The documentary contains other shocking allegations. Ibrahim says he was shot at after coming ashore on the island of Samos, taken back out to sea with 2 companions and thrown overboard. The 2 others drowned.
Un porté le Camerounais et quand je lève la tête, je vois ils ont balancé le Camerounais dans l'eau. Les voyants disaient sauvez-moi, sauvez-moi, je ne veux pas mourir.
The Greek Coast Guard says that it strongly rejects all accusations of illegal activities and works tirelessly and with the utmost professionalism and a strong sense of responsibility and respect for human life and fundamental rights, adding that they were in full compliance with the country's international obligations. For 9 years, Greece has been on the front line of an issue that resonates right across Europe. Stopping the boats remains as politically charged as it was when the refugee and migrant crisis erupted almost a decade ago. Paul Adams, BBC News.
And you can watch Dead Calm Killing in the Med on the BBC iPlayer now. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has disbanded his war cabinet just over a week after the former General Benny Gantz, who was a centrist, quit. Decisions about the war with Hamas in Gaza will now be made with a pre-existing security cabinet and the larger full cabinet. Well, let's go to Jerusalem and to our correspondent Lucy Williamson. Lucy, why has the Prime Minister done this, and will it have any impact on the war?
Well, this was widely expected after Benny Gantz left the war cabinet, and it's true that Benjamin Netanyahu has lost a little bit of political cover with this. But I think it's important to remember that in some ways his biggest political constraint always came from outside that war cabinet. It came from the two far-right leaders of the two far-right parties in his coalition, and they've threatened to withdraw their parties and bring down his government if he makes decisions over Gaza that they don't like, primarily making a deal with Hamas to end the war. And we saw yesterday how sensitive some of those decisions can be when the Israeli army said it was going to enact a daily tactical truce along one stretch of road to try and get more aid in. Now, today, the impression we have from the ground in Gaza is that it hasn't made much difference to the aid being delivered along that short stretch of route. But the two far-right leaders were furious. And that left Benjamin Netanyahu in a tricky position because he's under pressure within his own government over decisions like this. But without real change on the ground in Gaza, the international pressure he's under isn't going away.
Thank you, Lucy. The actor Sir Ian McKellen has been taken to hospital after falling off a stage in London's West End. The 85-year-old had been taking part in a fight scene in a performance of Player Kings, a Shakespeare adaptation, which was then abandoned. The play sees Sir Ian take on the lead role of Falstaff for the first time in his career. At the Euros in Germany, an England fans group is asking for an urgent review of travel arrangements in Gelsenkirchen after England supporters were left stranded for hours after the match against Serbia last night. To date, the England team were back at their training camp after Jude Bellingham's goal put them top of their group. Meanwhile, Scotland have been training ahead of their match against Switzerland on Wednesday. Andy Swiss reports.
He's just 20, but he's England's talisman. Jude Bellingham is already the fans' favourite here in Germany, and you can see why. They chanted, to his obvious delight.
No, I like the Beatles. I listen to the Beatles a lot. My style of music's a bit old, so that's right up my street. But yeah, I really enjoy playing in front of the England fans. You know, obviously they give me a lot of appreciation, a lot of love, and I try and give that back with my performances and my energy on the pitch.
This morning, those who didn't play yesterday were training at England's base in Blankenheim, while those who did recovered from an often nervy experience.
Too. Many of them struggled to leave the stadium after the game because of transport problems. They'll be hoping their next match against Denmark on Thursday is an altogether more comfortable experience.
This was the scene at Gelsenkirchen station nearly 3 hours after the game ended. Fans were left stranded because there weren't enough trains, and some ended up walking miles through the night.
Fans still being in Gelsenkirchen 3 hours after the game is finished at 2 o'clock in the morning is just absolutely ridiculous. It's completely unacceptable, and that is purely down to the transport infrastructure that was put in place.
Scotland, meanwhile, are preparing to face Switzerland, and they're hoping to forget.
As well, but I think they can see it's a real, genuine side here with the lads that want to give their all for their country, and that's what they'll continue to do.
One game gone then, but for Scotland and England, two very different results, as their Euros hopes now face a pivotal week. Andy Swiss, BBC News, Gelsenkirchen.
Elsewhere at the Euros, Slovakia caused a major upset as they beat group favourites Belgium 1-0. The team ranked third in the world had 2 goals disallowed and were ultimately beaten by a team ranked 48th in the world. Meanwhile, Romania stunned Ukraine 3-0 with only their second ever win at the Euros. Their first was a full 24 years ago. And later, France took on Austria. Was there to be another upset? Patrick Geary was watching.
The bigger the star, the bigger the...
Les Bleus are on their way.
This was not spectacular, but for this much-fancied France, it is.
Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Sarah Keith-Lucas. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Rita. After the first half of June, which was fairly unsettled and rather cool as well, we're just about turning a corner now into something a little bit more summer-like. In fact, temperatures in London reached 23.5 Celsius today, and we had some really vivid colours above the sky in London as the sun went down a little bit earlier on. So this is where we've had the rain over the past few hours. We've actually had some thunderstorms that have been quite heavy across the southeast of Scotland, northeast England as well. All these heavy showers are now starting to clear away, so it'll be drying up there as low pressure clears off into the North Sea. But we've got another area of low pressure down to the south, and that could well push a bit of rain into the far southeast of England at times on Tuesday. Now for the rest of tonight then, still quite cloudy, particularly across parts of Scotland with a few spots of rain. Clearer skies further south across England and Wales. It's here that we could see temperatures 6 or 7 degrees in the countryside, but most of our towns and cities around 8 to 12 first thing tomorrow. So we start the day on a mostly dry note. We have still got the cloud bringing a few showers across northern Scotland. It'll be relatively cool here, and just that threat of a bit of a rain down towards the far southeast, so perhaps East Sussex, the coast of Kent as well, but it should clear away fairly quickly. A scattering of showers still developing tomorrow through the Pennines up towards central Scotland as well. Either side of that, a lot of dry and fairly bright weather on the cards. Temperatures 15 to 22 for most of us, but again a little bit cooler than that, just 12 for the likes of Stornoway there in the north of Scotland. Now moving through into the middle of the weekend, we have got this area of high pressure building its way in from the Atlantic, squeezing most of the weather fronts away. So I think by Wednesday, most of the showers should fade away. It's looking largely dry with some longer spells of sunshine around by this stage, and that should lift temperatures. But we will see a bit more cloud and a few spots of rain in the far northwest. 21, 22 degrees in the sunshine, remains largely dry and settled into Thursday too. Rita.
Good news. Thank you, Sarah. And that is tonight's BBC News at 10. Now on BBC One, it's time to join our colleagues for the news where you are. Good night.